Hi, hello, and welcome back to Lancer, our favorite mech tabletop RPG, where today we're going back into the depths of the lore and to Second Committee, this big boogeyman of Union's past that touches a lot of elements within the setting, and made an effort to touch all those elements. To unite all of humanity, of course, which keeps them in line with the general three committees, first, second, and third. Union is still that core doctrine, or at least the one that they all agreed on. Just in how you go about it and what the end result should be, or look like, that one they disagreed on. But now to where we first left off, kind of, with the Union videos. Back in First Comm, that first expansion period. Because Sec Comm doesn't have an official, it does have an official date labeled in the histories, but it's not a period in itself. It's just an event during the first expansion period where they were founded, namely in the dissolving of the First Committee. Specifically during the firing of Piston 1, a mass kinetic interstellar kill cloud heading towards Onyx space. It is that act of directed annihilation that marks the beginning of Second Committee. Because one of the reasons they were pushed to that, partly through anthro-chauvinist elements, which we'll touch on a little bit later, but one of the big views on their project to unite humanity in this first expansion period. How did Sec Comm look at this period when compared to First Comm's second chance for humanity? To choke the stars with life. Because that first expansion has been well underway, because the first expansion period had been going on for nearly 900 years at this point, not to mention earlier attempts at recontact, sending colonization vessels not just out to other members of the previous 10 or ancient star maps, some of the more recent expeditions out into the stars, or the maps and designs given them by the Valedores, that initial boost and push to colonization. First Comm, however, was still kind of in a fire and forget phase. Sure, you were still members of Union and you'd be making efforts into getting people to join, but it was more just to choke the stars with life, just get people out there, just to put humans out there to spread. However, a lot of those earlier recontacts, not just the notorious ones of the Carrick Trade Baronies and the Ionic Ascendancy, or Acumen at this point, it turned out that other members of the 10 and some of the other colonies First Comm sent out, a good chunk of them didn't want to join Union. It wasn't just the fact that they wanted to go against uniting, the literal namesake of Union. Some of these interstellar powers went a different direction from what they perceived as humanity, and could be interstellar rivals, militarily and sources of annihilation. Humanity was a danger to itself. And if it wouldn't be unified peacefully, it will be unified by force. And that's half of the mentality that birthed Sec Comm. Because the other half was a word I've sprinkled about here and there, namely through other videos and just earlier in this one. Anthro-chauvinist, or anthro-chauvinism. So before getting too deep into what it is first, an example, or something you might have taken note of when looking across some of the other bits we've talked about. You might have noticed some of the inspirations or aesthetics of these different factions, the few we get actual visual examples of or details, bear striking resemblance and replications of modern day and older human cultures. This isn't a sci-fi oversight of not thinking about humans developing in isolation for hundreds of years. This was on purpose by Sec Comm, because with an anthro-chauvinist, when it comes to preserving humanity, they determined what humanity was as the things preserved in the massive vaults. The core world, Cradle, the homeworld of humanity is what defined and is humanity. All these other offspring, all these other divergent paths, the early wild diaspora, these were wrong. They have diverted, they have forgotten even their homeworld, what it is to be human, what it is to be human to an anthro-chauvinist. So there's one point. Second, humanity survived the Great Filter and they are destined to inherit the galaxy. A manifest destiny on all of the Milky Way. And there are a few other points, but they'll come up a little later. Because now as we hop back to the end of the first expansion period, it is marked with the Deimos event. And we've covered the Deimos event, so we're just gonna put that video, that link's up there. But now that we're on the Sec Comm timely proper, we get into the NEO-ANTHROPOCENE, which is a brief period defined by Union turning back in on itself, not in a violent sense, but consolidating its power. Researching, studying, preparing, and figuring out what just happened. And not just that, but how to exploit it, how to use it. It is from this one short, at least grand scale period, that we get the foundations of NHPs, the Omni-net, and blink gates. All the early forms of this technology and these systems built, refined, institutionalized on Cradle. Also a little fun bit, NHP was not the term used for them. It was just an AI that was fueled or powered or used the computation of a Deimos entity. It wouldn't be until way later that they got designated as NHPs, non-human persons. But this period ending with the first blink gate being built, we have the second expansion period, with more advanced sublight engines and now access to blink tech and NHPs. Though, speaking of NHPs, which I'm just going to call them that for the sake of convenience, there were specific versions of them created that were fleet mines. But this is one of the big advantages, on top of the other advantages SecComm just got from the NEO-ANTHROPOCENE, particularly shown in the Second Union-Karakin War, because a fleet mine is hooked up to your entire fleet and predicts the enemy's movements. To an alarming scale, because, sure, they view it as an AI, but it's an AI whose computation is in another reality, basically using it as a downscaled Oracle installation directly hardwired into your fleet. If you don't have a fleet mine that can counteract this, or tech specifically designed to hide yourself from this, your only chance is the predictability gap, getting in close and boarding. So for the Karakin doctrines of long-range naval warfare over light lag, that wasn't that useful. Nor would it be useful for any of the other systems that didn't have access to fleet mines. Even if they had a navy to begin with, which a lot didn't. Nothing sizable like SecComm at least. But with this new naval power rebuilding its navy with this new tech, these Deimos entities, the Omni-net to actually carry communications of great speed instead of having to rely on carrier vessels, and the first blink gate, ready for anyone to return when the next are built. Cradle prepared to be the heart of an empire. We have the second expansion period. Firstly, to mark this expansion period, the UAD, the Union Administrative Department, was changed to the UCM, the Union Colonial Mission, which was a bit more than just the colonizing part of that. But this entire period was marked with a rapid expansion. The sheer scale of it to try and colonize the bulk of the Urian Arm. Because sure, First Comm was going out into the stars. They still had vessels that couldn't quite get up to, just under the speed of flight, but pretty close. Now they had that, and they can reinforce it by building additional blink gates to add to the network. Not necessarily to propel a ship forward, but enough to immediately connect two worlds. Always pushing that new front line so the heart of the Empire can reach further. Alongside building up Omni-net relays and the earlier forms of Manna, we now see the Third Comm soft power tools that SecComm doesn't use as soft, or at least not as welcoming or freely. Blink gates are more obvious. You're not traveling through them unless SecComm wants you to, or allows you to at least. Such as the Karakin trade baronies, which were going right alongside with this expansion into these new systems to just extract as much as they can to keep building. This is also a lot of where the Karakin diaspora has spread and grown. As for the Omni-net relays and Manna, it wasn't as freely open to anyone using it, and the calculations for Manna were way more into the hard resources. The Union controlled who could access the Omni-net and what was allowed to be said on the Omni-net, alongside censoring, falsifying information, propaganda, controlling what currency can go where in its trade. Did you see that? Instead of welcoming and spreading and connecting the galaxy, it is strangling that information so they can control it. But we now get to another slight detail. Alongside those policies are their policies to clones. Another bit of their colonization is how do clones fit into it, because they don't. Not like they do in Third Comm, where a bulk of the initial population are clones, or at least artificial births. SecComm didn't view clones as people, they were property. And they only had a basic, keep them alive, don't let them immediately be injured by anything. The very basics of care were only for facsimiles. So the longer term growth. If you were a Flash clone, you are just a disposable object. Also, while it's not directly stated, cloning tech is mentioned earlier in Karakin history, before Union contact, and it's then mentioned in Union after contact. Again, not directly said anywhere, but I picture Union got most of its cloning tech and methods from Karakin space, initially. But yes, the anthro-chauvinists, clones are not people. But a weird quirk of that belief led to the bulk of the colonization effort being actual people. In SecComm's eyes and the anthro-chauvinist eyes being this continuation of humanity, not a replica or a clone somewhere else. It is a line you can trace all the way back to Cradle or the 10 back to Cradle. Within this span, moving billions of people to tens of thousands of worlds, not even including the ones that First Comm was already doing. It is noted as the single largest movement of human life. And the second expansion period covers the bulk of SecComm history. We would then be heading into the Hercynia crisis, which I feel is better served in its own video. Not just Hercynia itself, which would be talked about in that, but what happens around it in the aftermath SecComm leaves under Third Comm. No, we're going to be talking about SecComm's likely enforcement of some of these things. Because they did manage it, it was not the UAD though. It wasn't a Union administrator coming to look over a world and just try to slowly guide the local populace to be integrated into Third Comm. It's not that. In fact, after the UAD was dissolved into the UCM, it wasn't even any kind of administration. There wasn't a diplomatic effort. It was military. It was always the Navy first. And what did they want from these worlds? They wanted them to act human, to be a continuation of that human story, and to aid that colonial great expansion effort in the Navy. And of course, to help them enforce these values. While there are no explicit examples given until Hercynia, we do know of the mass violence in the Brushfire Wars, a general term still used in Third Comm, but with a slightly different meaning, which just gathers every conflict in the diaspora under one title. It is just an ever-present thing. There's always war in the diaspora. There is always that push forward, trying to bring humanity together to heal, to become core worlds, by force. But until they could prove themselves that they were human and that they were worthy of this development, they would just simply be used to further push that expansion, to further reinforce the Navy, to be material gold mines for the Karakin trade baronies. And in some cases, with the mass building of Foundry worlds, Union trying to not be as reliant on Krakus. And while they didn't directly administer, they wouldn't even consider anything not a core world as even really Union yet. Just something going to be into Union, just going to be a part of it. Currently, in its territory though. A lot of that would be by supporting just some of the local rulers or whoever would support Sec Comm. Be their face, be their representative. Local arms given to them, interstellar firepower, access to the local Omni-net relay. Not given to the people en masse of a world, but given to those loyal. With Sec Comm troops being stationed in nearly every system, populated system that is, and some not populated. The Union military was ever present, the humanity driven and shaped into its desired form, by the bottom of a boot or the barrel of a gun. But yeah, just killing populations that didn't exactly line up with humanity was on the table. On top of the Navy itself spreading, there's also these corporations spreading. The two big ones you know as the manufacturers are ips-n and SSC. Obviously GMS went with them. Also a restricted resource. That printing wasn't for everyone. Now onto what groups or kinds of people wouldn't really exist within Union. Firstly, touching back on the clones, because even though they weren't citizens and they were property, they were still used in mass numbers by Union and other factions during this time. Put it this way, SSC might not have needed that tagline during Sec Comm, or that just took a different meaning because they didn't view them as people. But on top of the usual stuff that you might find in the Karakin trade baronies of labor, shock troop soldiers, there were specific genetic lines and alterations to make them fit specific roles in combat. Bulkier, strange armored skin, enhanced eyes, a crazed intellect to map out environments. Again, they weren't human, they were a product. Property that could be changed, that could be altered. All of these, however, were never long-term. These warrior lines, these soldier lines that Sec Comm used, weren't meant to be permanent populations, or just to permanently live. Similar to Flash clones, even if they were facsimiles, they were deeply unstable. Either just impossible for them to breed or procreate, or also degenerate very quickly after use. And then, you know, the usual stuff from the anytime clones come up. Yeah, here they are again. But let's say you had a world that did have a mass clone population. Like, the original colonists didn't survive, but it was clones later that could survive. They were genetically altered to survive the harsh environment. Sec Comm would kill them all. Every one of them. They're not humans. To an anthro-chauvinist, it's a tool left behind. And the fact that they allowed them to procreate, what were the original colonists thinking? Early forms of androidness, modifying themselves, heavily built into cyborgs, a loose form of a hive mind through digital connection, also not human. Not even the fact that they're just clones, even if they are organic brains, they're just down the wrong path. They're not human anymore, they changed themselves. And it's not even just physicality, this idea of taking out the dogmatic or the mutant or the clone. It came to cultural beliefs as well, also certain religions. If it wasn't something stored in the massive vaults, it can't exist. With some notable exceptions. One, anything from Karakin space. Due to that new prosperity agreement, they were exempt of all this, or at least being the subject of it. But as the Navy was going out, if they found anything that Second Committee itself back in Cradle found useful, that would be incorporated and allowed as an exemption, and also further spread to other parts of Sec Comm. They were just picking and choosing. It wasn't even entirely locked to the massive vaults or ancient Earth. It's just what they defined humanity as. And that's just humanity. And they're about to bump into another intelligent species. Thank you for watching the video on Sec Comm. Sorry for potentially holding off on Hercynia, but I figured this would be enough to get the energy of Sec Comm going into the Hercynia crisis. And I already split up the Deimos event, so the Hercynia crisis, again, not just Hercynia, I feel fits its own video. But yeah, the various crimes of Second Committee, even before we get to the crisis, they're as numerous, if not more so, than the number of diasporan worlds and populations. Because even when it came to the cultural changes, it wasn't a slow guiding hand, it was like, hey, are you doing this? If not, we're gonna ban it, and if you continue doing it, we're just gonna kill you, or imprison you, or send you to a prison colony. It kind of went up to just whatever local navy was at the time. Now, Sec Comm left a scar, but it also left the foundations that Third Comm sits on. The Blinkgate network, the Omni-net, Manna, its early form of it, and some other things that we'll talk about during the Crisis video. But anywho, thanks again for watching, a thank you to my patrons, and have a nice day.
Out of all our rightfully owned worlds, we reserve the best ones for our citizens.